Chapter 16 I woke up the day after the earthquake in a much better place. I was in the middle of recording the Criss album, and I did have a record deal and a great bunch of guys who loved me. It's not like I had nothing. That day, I had an appointment for my yearly checkup with my doctor, Terry Hammer, who was also a close friend. I always loved seeing him. He's such a giving human being. I got in my rental car and had to take the local streets to Torrance because the town was a mess and a lot of sections of highway had collapsed. We talked a little bit about the earthquake, and then I confessed to him how close I had come to committing suicide. "Really?" he said, concerned. "I think I should give you something for depression. You've been through a lot, Peter. Your mom dying, your marriage dissolving, the earthquake." "Don't worry," I said. "The thoughts are gone. I'll be fine." "All right, but call me if you need me," he said. "I'm always here, and I love you." I went back to the car for the ride back to Hollywood. Before I took off, I checked the trunk of the car. I'd brought the bag with my 100,000 in cash because I didn't want to leave it back at the apartment. I had heard there was a lot of looting going on post-earthquake. I also had the 357 in the bag, along with a 38. And, just to be safe, I was carrying a tiny 25 automatic in my money pocket. You couldn't be too careful amidst all this chaos. Hey, I was a street kid. On the way back I got deterred and wound up in a shady part of Venice. I pulled up to a stop sign and there was a 6-foot, 4-inch black guy who looked really fucked up in the crosswalk. He was taking his sweet time to walk in front of me and I got pissed. I was ready to run him over. When he just about made it past the car, he hit the side of the hood with his fist. I gave him the finger. I looked down for a second, and the next thing I knew it felt like my head had shattered. This guy came around to my open window and punched me right in my orbital bone, shattering my cheekbone and part of my jaw. It helped that he was wearing big brass knuckles. I had never been hit that hard in my life. Not only did I see lights, I saw explosives. I slumped over, I was in another world. Now this guy had the door open and he was tugging at me, trying to get me out of the car. Thank God my seatbelt had jammed. I had sort of come around and I saw that he'd gotten frustrated and was walking away. That's when I thought, shoot the motherfucker. Motherfucker. Take the 25 and go behind him and shoot him in the head. You won't get arrested. He hit you with brass knuckles, he tried to rob you, you're famous, and you shot him in self-defense. But you don't just shoot someone in the back of the head, another part of me argued. You were in shock. Any good lawyer can get you off that. Just show the jury your injuries. I wasn't really rational at this point, but I finally realized that the last thing I needed to do was kill someone. I was bleeding profusely, and the best thing to do was to get home. I got to the apartment and gingerly walked through the rubble to the bathroom. The mirror had shattered, but there was a big enough piece of it to check out the injury. Holy fucking shit, I gasped. My face looked as if it had been run over by a truck. I got really dizzy and I went into the bedroom and fell on the mattress that was on the floor, and passed out. The next morning, I woke up in excruciating pain. I looked down at the mattress and it was literally soaked in blood. I called Michael, my new guitar player, and he came right over. He took one look at me and turned pink, purple, and blue. "Catman, you're really fucked up," he said. He rushed me down to the car and we drove back to my doctor friend Terry's office. Terry walked into the room and his face hit the floor. "Peter, are you all right?" Before I could even answer, Terry was ordering X-rays and making plans to contact a surgeon. "Just my luck, Dr. Lo was down the hall, one of the best reconstructive surgeons in L.A. Terry called him and he came in and he took one look and said, "We've got to operate now. I'll call the hospital to have him admitted." They rushed me into surgery and I was in there for 5 hours. It was a very painful procedure. They had to go through my mouth to reconstruct the cheekbone. This doctor was pretty rough, and he didn't have the best bedside manner. One thing I learned, your bones are not meant to be held together by screws. One whole side of my face had the scaffolding device, so I couldn't really move my head. I was in so much pain the whole time I was in the hospital that I kept pressing that button for dope non-stop. I think my morphine bill alone came to 10 grand. I was so excited the day that Deb and my daughter came to visit me. I was still in love with my ex-wife. But she came in and she was as cold as ice. She just stared at me. "How are you feeling? Are they taking care of you?" she asked in a real off-hand manner. I could hardly talk because my jaw was wired and my face was all bandaged. But I could feel the iciness filling the room. I could understand that my daughter might be in shock to see her dad fucked up like that, but Deb's aloofness was just reprehensible. When they left, the room just filled with loneliness. I was lying there wishing that she would just die, that on the way home she'd crash the car and my kid would survive, but she'd be killed. I would never have treated a dog the way she treated me in that hospital room. When my doctor friend Terry came in that night to check on me, I was beside myself. "I can't believe she just came here and walked out and she ain't coming back," she told me that, I wailed. "I don't even know if I want to get better." To add insult to injury, Terry confessed that it was his idea for Deb to visit me. I really felt like I didn't want to live. I just lay there in that bed crying, thinking, how could people be like that? This was a woman whom I had put up on a pedestal, bought her anything she ever wanted. And now my doctor was showing me more love than my ex-wife. I felt like the world had forgotten Peter Criss, that I was just another casualty of the wars of L.A. After the earthquake. As much of a cocksucker as I may have been in the past toward other people, I could never have pulled off something as heartless and selfish as Deb had. I knew that if it had been Deb in that hospital bed, I would have visited every day even if I didn't love her anymore. The Catholic in me would been there with flowers. She was still the mother of my daughter, and that connection would never fade. But for her to leave me there in that bed like a wounded animal and not show an ounce of compassion was heartbreaking. That was the worst pain someone could experience, much worse than the violence that had put me in the hospital. It was a pain that I carry even today. And I can never forgive her for that. I could forgive her for fucking around behind my back, but this was deeper to me than cheating. I just couldn't comprehend how the mother of my child could be that callous and cold to me. But my band members dropped by often, and Terry came in every day to check on me. I finally got released and they brought me out in a wheelchair and Michael came to pick me up and he was horrified. My whole face was bandaged up and my eye was sagging off to one side. I looked like a mummy. That day I nicknamed him Angel because he and Tall Man were the only ones who really took care of me. They put my bed back together and cooked me meals, whatever I could eat with a straw. Tall Man even slept on the floor beside my bed because we were still getting some aftershocks. I had to keep going back for follow-ups to make sure the screws were in place and that I hadn't developed an infection. But I had an album to finish, and the record company kept calling me to see when it would be done. All that was needed to complete the album were my vocals, so I bit the bullet, so to speak, and went back in the studio. I carefully removed the wiring from my jaw, popped a bunch of painkillers and swigged them down with some scotch, and went in and sang. I thought I was being noble and strong and showing the band some real leadership, but I'd go home and cry all night from the pain. When I'd go back to the doctor, he'd explode, "Why are these screws moving? You can't sing right now. But I did. To this day, I still get pain in my face. When I recovered, the guys urged me to go back out on the road. They were so uplifting and so great to be around. There wasn't the constant game playing that went on with Gene and Paul. These kids adored me, they looked up to me. I was the old timer, and everything I said was gold. I thank God to this day that they were around at this time when I was getting beat up from all angles. Deb let me slide on the child support payments until I had healed. The IRS wasn't so compassionate. Every so often I'd get another bill, and it seemed that the amount I owed was doubling. Not that I could pay anything anyway. Or even knew how to. I had been married most of my life and I always had my wives or people like Criss taking care of things. So I never even knew what to do with a bill. When I moved into my apartment, I started getting gas and electric bills. I called Tall Man. "What the fuck is this?" "Those are bills, dude," he explained. He literally took me to a bank and opened up a checking account for me and showed me how to make out the checks and keep a record of them. I was 47 years old and learning how to write a fucking check. When you're living in that fame bubble, you don't have to worry about anything but playing. It took me a long time to adjust to real life. Now I had to go out looking like a mummy, and it wasn't pleasant. The last thing I expected was to find a girlfriend in this state, but somehow I did. On the ground floor of my building there was a big food store with spectacular food, and being a bachelor and recovering from my surgery, I wanted to eat right and regain my strength for the tour. I was shopping there one night and I saw a cute little redhead approaching me in the aisle. She was in her 30s and she was wearing a white shirt and black tie like waitresses wear, and that impressed me. We started talking and she didn't seem to be at all taken aback by the bandages on my face, which impressed me even more. She had a majorly cool personality and we started talking about food and she told me she worked at a Japanese restaurant. I got her phone number, I called her, and we went out for some high-end Chinese food on Beverly Boulevard and we had a great time. The next time Lynn and I went out, I brought her back to my apartment and one thing led to another and we screwed all night. She was really hot and she had nice perky natural boobs, which you don't often see in L.A. Lynn was a real exotic knockout. A half Swedish, half Hawaiian mix. I was not the most handsome man at that point, especially with my eye hanging down like Igor's, but that didn't seem to bother her. I was just beat up in general from my divorce, from the loss of my fortune, from all the drugs I had taken, and here was this girl who looked right past that, so I was truly grateful. The Criss album, Cat Number 1, came out in August of 1994. I learned firsthand what it was like to be on a chintzy label like TNT. They had no real distribution, so when Tall Man and I went to their office in the valley, I saw boxes and boxes of the record stacked up in a supply room. "What's going on with the record?" I'd ask. "Oh, it's going good. We got orders," they'd say. But there were no promo people pushing it, nobody out there hawking it. One day they got the bright idea that if I did a bunch of interviews, it would sell some discs. So I sat there from 9 in the morning until 10 at night, doing the same interview over and over again. It didn't make an impact. I was furious that I had signed such a bad deal. My only hope was to hit the road, play in a city, do an in-store signing, and move some records. Meanwhile, my relationship with Lynn was blossoming. We were seeing each other every weekend and I suggested that we move in together. But I was over Hollywood by then and I told her that I wanted to live near the ocean. She suggested Venice Beach, one of the coolest spots in L.A. There were bodybuilders there, hippies, skateboarders, beautiful chicks walking by all day half naked. What's not to like? We found an adorable pink beach house with a big living room, a decent sized bedroom, and a guest room. It had wood floors and a fireplace, and the rent was reasonable, especially since we were going to split it. I was sick of being taken to the cleaners by women. I wanted her to feel that she had to contribute something if we were going to be in a relationship. Things started out okay. We'd bicycle on the promenade every day until the sun would go down, and then we'd have a margarita at a local joint. It was a really cool life for a while. Then one day she told me that she had lost her job at the Japanese restaurant. "I'm actually a topless dancer now," she said. I didn't know it then, but she always had been. "I don't really give a shit. I love you, whatever you do is cool with me," I said. But it really wasn't. I settled for it at first. She would get home at 3 in the morning and I had to get up and rehearse all day with the band for our tour. I had done a few tours with the band, or at least with Tall Man, who was the only original member left. Those early tours had been brutal. We had a shitty beat up bus and I'd curse from the first day I got on it. But the guys loved it, they didn't know any better. There were a few nice moments. On our second tour we were driving through Yellowstone in a blizzard on a 2-lane melt top road, and when we got down to the valley floor, a herd of buffalo started running alongside the bus. We opened the door and you could literally touch them, they were so close. My Smith & Wesson 45 came out a lot on those early tours. Tall Man would open the curtain on his bunk a little bit and he'd see me waving it around. I think I busted a few caps into the pool in Lake Tahoe. Hey, it was boring on the road. We didn't really know what we were doing those first tours. Hippie Bob was the road manager, and he was in charge of the merch. We found out that he had brought only one box of T-shirts on the tour, and that was the only way we made our extra money, since we didn't have any albums yet back then. He sold out the T-shirts the first night, and that was that. But he did keep the guys in righteous weed. We all made it clear that if there wasn't top of the line smoke, we weren't going out. Bob came through and delivered a nice little package to each guy on the bus. I had Tall Man handle all the business. He'd get all the shit straightened out and then he'd present me with the options and I'd make the final decision. For doing that, I gave him a percentage of the profits. The agents, the manager, the record company told me I was out of my mind and that I should just pay him $125 per show like the other guys got, but that didn't seem fair. He was taking on a lot of responsibility and he deserved to be rewarded for that. For the new tour, he found us a great Silver Eagle bus. They were the original rock and roll buses. This one probably had 1,000,000 miles on it, but it was dynamite inside. It slept 12 and there was a game room in the back with lounge chairs and a big television in the middle. Each bunk had nice curtains and a small TV. There was a nice sized kitchen and a bathroom. I didn't know how we could afford it, but the guys decided they would rather go in comfort and be safe than have a bigger paycheck. This was the tour that the captain emerged. The first day, I walked onto the bus wearing a Navy officer's blue coat with the hash marks and gold stripes, and I had on an officer's overcoat with the stars and epaulets. On top of my head was a white admiral's hat with the Navy emblem. I looked like a white Michael Jackson. Our bus was going to be called the Enterprise, and I was going to run it like Captain Kirk. Mark, the tall man, was my number 1. Angel was number 2. Whoever was the vocalist, and they changed often, was number 3. The driver even got into it. "Are we ready for warp speed, Captain?" he'd yell back. "Absolutely, let's leave this shithole," I'd say, and we'd take off. "Everybody in their quarters?" I'd ask. "Yes, Captain," I'd hear them all answer. A lot of that was just bravado to hide my pain. I was still hurting and angry. I was missing Deb. I really loved her still, even though she had run off with my lawyer, and I loved my daughter deeply and I never got to see her enough. The IRS was still up my ass and I was in a band that was playing shitty little bars with pool tables and drunks shouting throughout the whole show, and then I was going to my tiny room at a Motel 6. Some nights I'd go to the back room on the bus and lock the door, which meant no video games for the boys. I was amazed by how much beer I could drink and not get drunk. I was so depressed. I'd put on the Eagles' Desperado and play it over and over and over. Then that feeling of doom would come over me and I'd obsess over what I had lost, especially Jean. The pain from the screws would start in my face, and many nights I cried myself to sleep, my face in the pillow so the guys wouldn't hear me like that. Sometime during that tour in 1995, I got the news that my dad had died. I'm certain it was from a broken heart. He had actually given up on life after my mother passed on in 1991. He was just lost without her. Even though my sisters took care of him, he didn't care about eating or washing or getting out. I had gone to see him before the tour and I stayed with him for 2 weeks. He had been having some episodes of pleurisy that required constant monitoring and routine treatment, but he just wouldn't cooperate with the doctors. It killed me inside to see him like that. I felt so bad for him. He was such a strong man in his heyday. Tall man, and I took a plane to New York and made it to the funeral. This was the horror trifecta. My mom had died in 91, my favorite Uncle George died 2 years later, and 2 years after that, my dad was gone. I went back to the tour and I stayed drunk for a week. I realized how much I had missed my father and how much I wished we could have communicated better. I was a cocky kid and I would visit them with the Mercedes and the hot blonde, acting like a big shot. I wouldn't do that now. Over the years I began to understand his frustration, his own private suffering. He was totally dependent on my mother, and I think he felt guilty for that. So when she died, he lost the will to live. Being on that bus with a bunch of kids who had such heart and spirit was what got me through those grueling 12-hour drives. I saw myself in them, the same gleam in the eye we all had at the beginning of Kiss. They were so thrilled to be a part of rock and roll, even at this level. Angel had family in St. Louis, and when we got there, they all came to the show and were so proud of him. He showed off the bus to his parents. I just fed off their youth and their positive outlook and their energy and their joy to be playing with me. That got me through the darkest hours. I did have my idiosyncrasies, though. I could never really sleep on the bus. It was hard for me to sleep anywhere, but I hated sleeping on the bus. Especially after I heard that Gloria Estefan and her group had that horrible accident when the bus driver fell asleep. I'd think of that and I'd be in my berth with my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling all night. Sometimes I'd get some coffee and sit up front and bullshit with the driver all night. About an hour before we got into a town, I'd call Tall Man to my quarters. Tall Man, just get me to my room at the hotel and then come back right before showtime. You do the sound check, have my tech sit on the drums. I don't want to see the place before I have to. Then I slept for a few hours. Around 6 the road manager would knock on my door and bring me food, usually some tacos that tasted like chicken marinated in sweaty gym socks. I was a picky eater. What the fuck is this? I'd ask the road manager. It's a burrito, Captain. Do I look like a guy who would eat a burrito? I'd throw it at the wall and make him go back and get something else. Then Tall Man would come in with the scouting report. So how's the club? I'd ask. It's not so bad, Captain, he'd fudge. How many people are there now? About 50. But they expect it to be packed at showtime. What's the capacity? 250. That's about how many people I used to take out partying after a Kiss show, I'd lament. Tall man, I can't do this. Come on, Captain, we can do it. So I'd have him get a couple of rolling rocks and I'd get ready. I'd put on some tight jeans with glitter and snakes down the sides and I'd pick out a killer shirt and vest and a nice scarf. I'd punk my hair up and put on some eyeliner and good old number 15, a makeup from the old vaudeville days that gave you the best complexion a man could have. Then I'd put a little rouge on my lips and some on my cheeks. I'd look in the mirror, down another beer, and we'd get back on the bus. We'd pull up to the dump and they'd always have big banners advertising Budweiser or Jack Daniels alongside old posters of bands that once played there. There'd be tons of vehicles parked in the lot, mostly pickup trucks. I'd walk in the back entrance and make my way through the kitchen and I'd hear the noise get louder and louder and then we'd enter the main room and take the stage. I didn't even want to look at the people in the audience, so I'd walk in with my head down, wearing big, round, dark glasses. I'd get behind the drums and when I finally raised my head and looked out, I'd see a sea of Kiss fans. And they'd all demand to hear Kiss songs. But we played all originals for most of the set until the end. When we'd all come out to the front of the stage with acoustic instruments. I had a really cool percussive box that I'd play. We'd do Hard Luck Woman, Nothing to Lose, Strange Ways, and then we'd end with Beth. We'd win them over and they'd cheer for an encore. One night we were playing someplace in Quebec, and when we started into Beth there was a wave of energy from the crowd that almost knocked us on our asses. We finished late that night, there was a blizzard, and we had a 10-hour drive back to New Jersey, so we walked right off the stage and onto the bus. It was like, let's get out of here, no autographs. But that crowd came out of the club, surrounded the bus, and started rocking it back and forth. You think you're leaving? You're not going anywhere, they seemed to be saying, so we stayed for a while and signed all their stuff. We played some great places too. In New York, we did a show at the Limelight, which was an old converted church. We tore the roof down and got great UPS in the newspapers. But then there were places like the Sandbox. We were wondering about that name when we pulled into Wheeling, West Virginia. I was dropped off at the hotel and slept and ate my meal. Now it was time for Tall Man to report. How's the place? I asked. I can't tell you or you won't go. You'll get right back on the bus and drive to the next gig. I was still wondering about the name when I entered the club through the kitchen. I couldn't believe my eyes. The club was literally a sandbox. They had filled the entire floor with sand and they had tacky paintings of palm trees and the sun on the wall. The stage was made out of plywood and it was so wobbly that Tall Man got hit in the face by his own microphone. After the second number, everyone was up and dancing. The sand and dust was kicked up and permeated the air. I wanted to throw my sticks down and leave. Talk about being humiliated, about feeling like a piece of shit after you'd been in the one of the biggest bands in the world. Now you're playing the Sandbox. And the next gig was at a place called Uncle Tom's Cabin. I was miserable. Which oftentimes led to what we called the Greyhound treatment. The Greyhound treatment was usually reserved for incompetent road managers, sometimes sound guys. We'd instruct the bus driver to find the nearest Greyhound station, have the guy pack his bags, and we'd pull up, open the doors, out he'd go, the doors would close, and we'd move on. One guy who got Greyhound was a tour manager with a shaved head whom we nicknamed Fester. We were staying at a hotel in the Midwest that had balconies. I was upstairs and the guys were beneath me. We had finished the gig, there was no food, and I was starved. Where's the fucking food? I yelled down off my balcony at Fester. Food and sleep. Food and sleep, that's all we want. It was about 2 in the morning and Fester went out to get some food. He came back at 4 and reported to number 1. He had scrounged up 2 microwave TV dinners. "You're really going to take that upstairs, man? Are you serious?" Tall man warned Fester. Fester brought it up to me, and the next thing tall man saw was 2 microwave TV dinners frisbeed off my balcony. Fester was on the Greyhound the next morning. When we toured for Cat number 1, our lead singer was Mike Stone. He was a great singer. He wore a cool mohawk and always had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. But he left for a deal that fell through, and then he hooked up with Queen's Rick. We replaced Stoney with a singer, guitarist named Jason Ebbs. He got the job because we needed to go out and there was nobody else around. Jason would play and sing out of tune. But he was a good-looking guy with dreads, a real chick magnet, so we hired him. One night Jason played the entire set out of key. I kept telling him to check his tuning, but with each song it got worse and worse. When the set was over, he was standing near the stage talking to some chicks and I walked over and hit him in the back of the head. "You will never play out of tune on stage with me again," I screamed. "You're fired." We got on the bus that night and there was stone silence. Everybody was tiptoeing around because I had turned into this monster. One by one, the guys came up to me and told me I was being hard on Jason. They were right. I have a big heart, so I kept him on. He never played out of tune again. There were always groupies around, but I let the boys have them. I really wasn't too sexual at this point. When I was out on the road right after my split with Deb, I hated all women. I had a hard and fast rule: no women on the bus. But sometimes I'd loosen up. After every gig, the girls would line up alongside the bus. Once in a while, I'd pick out about 10 of them and bring them on board. They'd be sitting there giggling and tall man would break out the beers and the girls would all get fucked up. Then we'd say, "We're pulling out tonight for a 10-hour drive. You could come, but I don't know how you'll find your way back." And they'd say they wanted to go, thinking that they were going to have a good time with me. We'd sit there and I'd be grabbing their titties and biting them on the neck and making out with a few of them and getting them all crazy, and then I'd say, "I'm going to bed. I've had it." The girls would be in shock, but then the boys would jump on them. Tall man was tall and thin, with beautiful blue eyes and long dark hair. Angel was like Robert Plant, with big blonde curls and the face of an angel. Our lead singer was always good looking. So I'd lie back there and hear them fucking all night. When we were staying in hotels, it was a different story. Tall man would grab a stack of business cards from the hotel where we were staying and he'd hand them out at the gigs to the best-looking girls. Then I'd make my appearance in my captain's hat and the girls would all go, "Oh." Then I'd play around for a while, but I'd go back to my room alone. We were on hiatus at the beginning of the summer of 1995 when I heard that Kiss was doing a convention tour and they were going to be in L.A. For years, fans had been organizing unofficial Kiss conventions where they'd meet and sell their Kiss collectibles. After a while, Gene and Paul decided that they should be making all that money, so they organized a Kiss convention tour. For $100 admission fee, a fan would get a laminated pass and access to the booths that were selling all the Kiss merch. Of course, Gene and Paul would get a cut out of anything sold. There would also be a 2-hour appearance where the band would take requests and play songs and answer questions from the fans. Right away, I realized that the band couldn't be doing well if they had to co-opt the fans' gatherings. Gene and Paul decided to remake all their merch and sell it again. They even had their road manager call me and ask if they could sell Peter Criss drumsticks. I wound up ordering 5,000 pairs of drumsticks, and they sold like hotcakes. I was getting checks for a few $1,000s every month from the conventions. I thought, if I'm making a few thousand on some drumsticks, what are they making? There was going to be a convention in L.A. on June 17th, and I wanted to take Jeannie so she could get a better appreciation for what her dad had done. I asked a journalist to get me in, and he had called Jean, who promptly called me. Peter, you don't have to ask somebody else, you're part of the band's history. This should be your place, too. We'll send a limo to pick you up. You'll be treated like a king, because you are. Whatever you want is yours. Why don't we have lunch tomorrow at the Sunset Marquee and discuss it? Jean could really bullshit you. I had just come off a Criss tour and I was playing really well and my voice was great. I'd just bought a Mitsubishi 3000 and I was living in Venice with Lynn. I felt good about myself for a change. So I pulled up to the hotel and Paulie was standing there in his leather pants and tight velvet shirt, open to the waist, and cowboy boots. I think he wanted me to see how good he looked right off the bat. He was kind of surprised to see me driving such a cool new car, but we exchanged pleasantries and walked into the hotel. Jean ran up to me all dramatic, as if he'd missed me all his life. He picked me up, held me in the air, and hugged me. I was thinking, fucking bastard, I'd like to stick a knife right in the fucking side of his neck. Because I still didn't like them, and I thought they were up to something as they always were. We ordered lunch and began catching up. We think you should sing at the convention, Jean said. We'll have a great time. And we're actually rehearsing in an hour right around the corner. Why don't you come over? Okay, so they wanted to test me. I went along with it. We got to the hall and I said hello to Bruce Kulick and Eric Singer, the latest replacements for Ace and me. Immediately Jean told me that the whole idea of me singing was Eric's. I didn't say anything, but I knew it was bullshit. Eric might have come up with the idea, but knowing them they put it in his head. They're trying to make this schlep look like a hero. Eric started sucking my ass and telling me how much he liked the way I sang, especially on Hard Luck Woman. You want to sing it now? Jean said. No, I forgot the lyrics, I lied. We have them right here, one of them said. And sure enough there was a music stand with the lyrics set up on it. They were going all out to see if I could still sing. I had been singing that song with Criss, so I sang the shit out of it and they were blown away. I drove back thinking, what the fuck was that all about? Then I called Tall Man. Watch out, Captain, they got a trap for you, he said. You're going into uncharted territory and those are fucking Vulcans, man. I'm well aware of that, number one, I answered. We went to the Hilton the day of the convention and it was mobbed because word had gotten out that I was going to be there. I knew that Jeannie didn't understand the extent of my fame, so the minute we arrived in that limo and were met by bodyguards and screaming fans trying to get at me, she was literally in shock. We went up to our room and Paulie came up and introduced me to his then wife Pam and their newborn baby. The baby was beautiful. Wow, you got a kid. Whoever would have thought, I said. It looked like Paul had settled down. He was a family man now, and I liked it. And Jean was now with Shannon Tweed and they had a couple of kids, so I got a good family vibe off this whole thing. Yeah, right. I went down and peeked out from behind the curtains and the place was packed. I heard Paul address the crowd. Remember earlier we were saying that without the 4 original guys, we would never be here today? We were talking about Peter and Ace. Well, I thought it might be something special, something you really deserve. You deserve this and it's gonna be a kick for us. We told Peter to come out and sing a couple of songs with us. And he started a P.E.T.E.R. chant. And he goes, Peter Criss, and the place exploded. They were crazier than my audiences on the road. I wanted to scoop them up and take them all down to the sandbox. They never sat down. When I walked up on that stage and the whole place went absolutely crazy, I felt so good. I looked at Jeannie standing off to the side and she looked so proud of me. I felt like $1,000,000, and I just wanted to sing the best I ever did. Jean and Paul probably thought that I would be doing it to impress them, but I was really doing it for my kid. I hugged Paul and Bruce and then sat down next to Jean to share his microphone. You know, originally Peter just wanted to come by and be with you and us. It was actually Eric Singer who said, "Why don't we get together and play?" Jean had to get that bullshit in. We went into Hard Luck Woman and the place went crazy. I couldn't believe that my daughter was standing to the side seeing all these people screaming for me. It was a real golden moment. We finished the song and I high-fived everyone. I looked over at Jean and he was smiling from ear to ear. I could hear the cash register in his head going ca, ching, ca, ching, ca, ching. You wanna hear more? What do you wanna hear? Jean said. There were a million requests, but we went into Nothing to Lose. We did a killer version, and then I waved goodbye to the crowd. Paul ran up and put a leather motorcycle jacket on my shoulders. They were selling it there. On the back it said Kiss Army, and there was a logo of a hand giving the finger. Paul wrapping the jacket around me and giving me a big hug, it just felt like the whole thing was scripted. They knew exactly what they were doing. They always did. Backstage everyone was hugging me, and Jeannie was blown away. Later I took some questions from the audience and managed to plug my upcoming tour with Ace. Then I went back upstairs and said goodbye to everyone. It had been a special day. I was about to get together with Ace again. George Swit, our old road manager, was now managing Ace and had gotten in touch with us to persuade us to join up with Ace for a tour of Canada. He wanted to call it the Bad Boys Tour, but I wasn't really a bad boy anymore. Still, it meant playing at bigger venues and making more money, so I agreed to do it. We had trouble right off the bat. Ace refused to open for us, so we went on first. But then we were supposed to come back on after 3 songs and do 3 songs together. That first night, Ace was on the 6th song and they hadn't called us up. Tall man went ballistic on Swit's ass. He was screaming at Swit and I was standing behind him smiling and saying, "Look what you get, George." From then on, we came on after Ace's 3rd song and did Hard Luck Woman, Strange Ways, and then ended with Rock and Roll All Night. I hated that idea. Why were we doing Jean and Paul's fucking song? We were that hard up for applause. But Swit was smart. 80% of Ace's set was Kiss songs. That's what the audience was really there for. We did all originals, so we didn't get the same response. For the most part, we were playing much better venues. But we did one show in Oklahoma where only 10 people showed up. Ace played for 3 hours that night, almost 20 minutes for each person in the audience. It was great to be back on the same stage with Ace again, after we'd been through so much together, but I got scared because he seemed to be getting worse with his antics of drinking and drugging. Ace could get away with anything because his band idolized him the way mine idolized me. The audience never knew it, but his roadies would fill up a 6-pack of Coke cans with rum and he'd get drunk every night on stage. By the time we did our encores, he could barely see me. Over the years that Ace and I were touring, both apart and together, we had heard that Jean and Paul would often send spies down to our shows to report back on how we were doing. Sometimes they would actually tell us that Jean and Paul had sent them. I figured they were just interested in seeing if Ace and I were still fucked up so they could gloat. But I think they were really planning a reunion years ahead of our actual reunion. Why shouldn't they? Kiss wasn't exactly on a roll after Ace and I left the group. Between 1979 and 1982, Kiss record sales dropped 75%. When Gene started dating Hollywood stars, he began thinking he should be a movie star, too. Of course, he wasn't a handsome man, so there was no way he was going to be a leading man. He wound up doing a couple of movies where he was cast as the heavy. You had to strap his fucking head down to contain his ego. He wasn't the sweet Gene, and even the monster was gone. He just became an egotistical Hollywood madman. He started managing Yvonne DiCarlo and he told me that he fucked her. A 63-year-old woman. Then he started a record company, and that failed. He founded a company to book bands, and that failed. Yet in his mind he was the world's greatest entrepreneur. The years that Ace and I were out of the band were easily Kiss's leanest years. David, their hairdresser, later told me it got so bad that one night they played for 500 people. Paul would joke, "Why don't we order 2 pizzas for the audience?" When they took off their makeup, Gene was totally lost. They became a hair band, and one thing that hair bands had was young, good-looking guys in them. These guys weren't young anymore. Gene just didn't know how to behave on stage without the demon persona. Like an old fighter, Gene never shook the habit of stalking the stage, but now when he would stick his tongue out, people would just laugh. It was sad, like watching Godzilla die. Then he started wearing loud, androgynous clothes, but he looked like a football player in a tutu. Paul was delighted, though. He could come out with pink feathers around his neck. He'd wear skin-tight pants and orange wristbands and he'd have all these bangles going up his arms in every fucking color in the world. He looked like an old drag queen. By 1983 Kiss fell millions into debt with their record company. They had to sell off land that they owned in Cincinnati. By 1988 they decided to scapegoat Howard Marks and Carl Glickman and they fired them along with Criss. Eventually they hired Dr. Jesse Hilson, Paul's shrink, to manage the group. He was a real doozy. Paul Marshall, our lawyer, said that Hilson used to call up the business office and threaten to let Paul go crazy unless he got paid. Now Hilson was in charge. He rented a penthouse suite and hired a full staff and began spending money left and right. He didn't last long before he fled the country. In a way, I was glad they were going through such hard times. I wanted them to learn a life lesson that they were not the geniuses who created this band, that the success didn't flow only from them but also from me and Ace and Bill and Sean and Criss and all those people who were now gone or fired. If they were so smart, why had they hired a charlatan psychiatrist to run their business affairs? Gene and Paul invited both Ace and me to do a convention stop in New York City. Neither of us could do it, but then George Switt told us that Kiss was offered a chance to do MTV Unplugged, and they wanted us to do a few songs together. Ace and I immediately told George to tell them to fuck off, but George was persistent. "This is fucking huge. I don't know if you two guys understand," he told us. "You guys haven't been together in 17 years. You've got to do this, it's going to help the tour, it's going to help record sales." Lynn and I flew first class to New York. I went to rehearsal the next day to make sure my DW drums were set up properly, and the first thing I saw were cameras everywhere. They were documenting everything on video without Ace's and my permission. I walked in and Gene went, "Hey, Peter Criscuola likes Coca-Cola. How you doing?" Then Paul and Eric came over and everyone was hugging and kissing and everything was love and peace and all that bullshit. Of course, Ace came in an hour late. "Acely, Acely, Acely," they said, and now Ace was getting the love treatment. The whole thing was weird. It just seemed like something underhanded was going on. Each day the rehearsals got harder, especially for Ace. It took Kulik hours to teach him how to play Beth on an acoustic. But we got through them. Come the day of the show we all got nervous, especially Ace. but he wasn't drinking because he didn't want to fuck this up and have to deal with Gene and Paul's wrath. When we got to the studio, there were hundreds of kids lined up around the block. They did the bulk of the show with their current members. Then Kulik and Singer left the stage. We're going to do something special. We got some members of the family here tonight, and we're not talking about mom and dad. We're talking about Peter, Criss and Ace Frehley, Paul announced. We walked onto a tumultuous ovation. I swear it was like walking onto the garden stage again, it was like that old feeling never went away. The energy in the room was just insane. And it was historic, too. This was the first time the original band played together without makeup. I don't think anybody expected this, did they? Ace said. Oh, it was a secret, Paul said. Let's see, what could we play? How about something from a couple of old friends of mine, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards? Ace suggested, and we launched into 2000 Man. The audience went wild. Then they set up a chair for me up front and I came off the drums and sat between Gene and Paul. Gene started tweaking my ear playfully. This is the sensitive stuff, Paul said, and we did Beth. Ace had mastered the song on acoustic and we sounded dynamite. I looked over at Gene and he had that ching gleam in his eyes again. He could just smell that money. Then Paul said, we're bringing everybody out, and when Bruce and Eric came back on, a large portion of the audience started booing them. "Kman," Ace admonished the crowd. "They're part of the family too." Frankly, I was astonished. Those guys had been in the band longer than me and Ace, and they're booing them? But the people had spoken. They didn't want them to come back because it was the original band again. We all did Nothing to Lose and then finished with Rock and Roll All Night. Years later, Gene wrote about that night in his own book. Bruce and Eric were kind throughout. In fact, they were so accommodating that they planted the seeds for what would become their worst nightmare. Their kindness enabled Ace and Peter to step in and unfortunately push them out of a job. What total bullshit. Yeah, the control freak was going to let an emotionally shaky guy, which is how he characterized me, and a drunk push two great musicians out of the way. All of a sudden, it was out of his control. Who does he think he's fooling? As soon as the Kiss Army booed Eric and Bruce, Gene realized that a reunion would be massively profitable. After the Unplugged show, Ace and I went on the road again. Shortly after this, George told me that he got a call and Kiss wanted to do a reunion. To me that meant millions of dollars, and I wanted it. I sure wasn't going to go on living in Venice Beach with a topless dancer and playing clubs like the Sandbar when I had had a taste of both the good life and the bad life. I preferred the good life. So I called a band meeting in my quarters on the bus. I'm going to leave the band. Kiss wants to do a reunion, and I have to do it. I'm too old to ride the Eagle with you guys. I want to get back to stadiums and earn some real money again. I have to think about my retirement someday. I have to get a little selfish here, I hope you guys understand. Tall man, who had the most to lose from this, said, I just want one thing, man. Front row seats at the shows. You got it, man, I said. Then it was time to deal with Lynn. We hadn't been getting along well for a few months. By the time we got back from the Unplugged show, the sex had become much less frequent. I realized that there's something nutty about any woman who goes to dance half naked in her 30s and gets paid for it. I don't want every topless dancer in the world to hate me for this opinion, but I just think there's another way of making a buck at that age. But who am I to talk? After Unplugged, I had to break up with Lynn. When I walked into the Rigoroyal Hotel that day in New York, I felt the power again. I was treated like a major star. This wasn't the Criss band on a bus. This was Peter Criss of Kiss, a side of me that Lynn had never seen before. I didn't want to be tied down, I wanted to be free and enjoy this ride. I didn't want to have to call and check in every night. So I told her that when I got back from the Bad Boys tour in December, I wanted her shit out of the house. She did it, but she hated me. She wrote me horrible, angry letters. I remember they said things like, "I'd like to tie you up to a chair and then fuck your brains out and then beat the shit out of you." So that didn't end well at all. We got back from our tour on December 20th. The bus pulled up to my little house in Venice and I unloaded my gear. Tall man told me I was due about $5,000, but I told the boys to keep it and divvy it up as a Christmas present. It was a poignant seeing the big eagle parked on that street with all these little houses, me bringing my drums into my now empty house. We had gone through a lot together. These guys had nursed me back to health when my face was all busted up. I really loved them deeply. I remember holding Tall Man, and he was crying. Then Angel started crying, and so did I. I began to have second thoughts, maybe I shouldn't leave these guys, I'd never be loved like this by bandmates again. The reality was we weren't going anywhere, the TNT deal was over, we didn't have any other prospects on the horizon. But we weren't dealing in reality that night. It was just pure emotion, all these guys hugging me like I was their dad, and they were saying goodbye to the best time of their lives. The bus was about to pull away when I ran inside the house and came back out with the rug. It was the rug on which Tall Man and I had written many of our songs. "Hey, this is yours, Tall Man," I said, and gave him the magic rug. He got all choked up and then they all got back on the bus and it pulled around the corner and out of my life. I walked into the house and closed the door. It was quiet as a mouse inside. I looked around and the closets were empty and all Lynn's stuff was gone. I tried to turn on the TV but she had the cable people take the box away, so I had nothing to watch. But I had a Betamax and a big collection of old movies on video. Suddenly I realized it was my birthday and I should celebrate. "You're going back with your band, you're going to make a lot of money, you can get out from under that IRS debt, maybe you can buy a nice house again and maybe even meet a nice woman." I marched out and bought a nice bottle of Dom Perignon. Then I went to a cigar store and asked the guy for his best cigar. The guy gave me a quizzical look. "I don't really smoke cigars, but it's my 50th birthday and I want to celebrate." "Well, this is the best one, kid," he said, handing over a cigar. It cost $25, but I didn't care. I got back to the house and threw on Hotel California. I loved that song. I poured myself a glass of champagne, lifted it up, and said, "Happy birthday, Peter. This is going to be a good year." I took a sip of the Dom and then lit the cigar. I started puffing away and I was turning green, but I didn't care. I just felt good. I looked in the mirror and watched myself puff on that stogie and drink my champagne and I started laughing at myself. "God, look at you, you crazy bastard. You're going to be rich again. Life is good, you fucker."